Dr. Julian Bollidy here from the Australian Urban Design Research Centre for today's lecture, Grappling with Novel Uncertainties Through Scenario Planning. The presentation is in 4 parts. Firstly, we'll be considering what is scenario planning and why it's important. We'll talk about how scenario planning developed, the different types of scenario planning, and how we conduct exploratory scenario planning, which is the main focus of today's lecture. So firstly, what is scenario planning and why is it important? Scenario planning is a method of long-term strategic planning that creates representations of multiple futures of a system of interest. The name comes from the theatrical term scenario, the script for a film or play. Scenarios are stories about the way the world might turn out tomorrow, stories that can help us recognise and adapt to changing aspects of our present environment. It does not involve predictions or forecasts of a single outcome. Rather, the intent is to offer a series of plausible situations based on multiple, usually contrasting assumptions of what the future might bring. So rather than being preordained and specified futures, scenarios are maps of the future that can be reworked, adapted, and if necessary, transformed. Ideally, it produces planning with strategic flexibility to ensure that plans can adapt to change and urges planners to pursue preparedness, robustness, and resilience, instead of drawing up plans that assume only one trend. So scenario planning emerges out of a model of contemporary cities as complex systems that are not fully knowable because they are open to outside influences that produce the decisions of many people and evolve over time. In this model, the precise effects of any intervention on the city are also unknowable. In this complexity, we are at the mercy of black swan events, small probability events with vast ramifications that have dramatic, far-reaching consequences. Most of the events that defined the 20th century were black swans and were not predicted. Examples include terrorists flying passenger planes into the World Trade Center, or some political revolutions, or the toppling of a presidency, as in Watergate. We have to assume that such massive, unpredictable events will occur. As individuals, or even as organizations, we have little control over these driving forces, these black swans. Our leverage for dealing with them comes from recognizing them and understanding their effect. This is where scenario planning comes in. So hindsight is useful for sharpening your foresight. Imagine you've been trying to write a scenario for yourself, your organization, or your country 10 years ago in 2014. What would have been the right scenario? What would have been the driving forces? What were the critical elements you could have seen that you didn't? It goes without saying that the pandemic was and is, in many respects, still a black swan. As of now, the pandemic has reached 7 million deaths. Would that have featured into your thinking? In thinking about this, it's important to discount what's called retrospective distortion. This is the problem of explaining past events without adjusting for the forward passage of time. It gives rise to the mistaken belief that these events were predictable at the time. This is an illusion generally and reflects our need to make sense of events after the fact. So why is scenario planning important for planning? Synoptic planning, or the rational comprehensive approach, such as embodied by people like Robert Moses pictured, is the dominant tradition in planning. So synoptic planning has roughly 4 classical elements. Number 1, goal setting. 2, identification of policy alternatives. 3, evaluation of means against ends. And 4, implementation of decisions. Such planning was based on the scientific notion that most things were knowable. There is the assumption that the trained professional can predict future developments and prepare the physical setting for such developments using tools such as statistical analysis, public surveys, and sometimes public consultations. Planners believe that they're able to prepare a complete scenario as possible of future events. The problem is that synoptic planning is often based on grossly simplified assumptions about the future, making for its inefficiency and heavy-handedness. Moreover, the often flawed forecasts reduce the usefulness of the plans they inspire. For example, they may lead to flawed decision-making, such as investments in unneeded infrastructure or mismatches between the supply and demand of public services. Although potentially more expensive and difficult than conventional synoptic planning methodologies, scenario planning speaks to such uncertainties and potentially yields superior outcomes, a more rigorous, adaptable, effective, and long-lasting plan. So how did scenario planning develop? Scenarios as a method for military planning first emerged following World War II, when the US Air Force tried to imagine what its opponents might do and to prepare alternative strategies. The approach was further developed in the 1950s when Herman Kahn at the RAND Corporation used the concept of scenarios in a series of strategic studies for military planning purposes, which were reported in the 1960s in a book called The Year 2000. where scenarios were defined as hypothetical sequences of events constructed for the purpose of focusing attention on causal processes and decision points. So Kahn believed that creating imaginative scenarios in the same way that a screenwriter develops plot alternatives could help in considering the future and its potential for nuclear war. Kahn notes, thermonuclear wars are not only unpleasant events, quite an understatement there, they are fortunately unexperienced events, and the crises which threaten such wars are almost equally unexperienced. Few are able to force themselves to persist in looking for novel possibilities in this area without aids to their imagination. Often there are options you don't consider because your fear paralyses you. A scenario forces you to consider it anyway. In this way, Kahn's scenario asked people to consider what most were denying in the early 1960s, that a full nuclear war might actually take place between the United States and the Soviets. Pierre Wack was an unconventional French oil executive who was the first to develop the use of scenario planning in the corporate world at Shell in the 1970s. In the mid-60s, Shell had introduced a system providing planning details for the whole process of moving oil from the ground to the tanker to the refinery, all the way to the petrol station on the corner. This was a sophisticated global system that looked ahead 6 years. However, unconsciously managers designed the system to develop Shell's business in a familiar, predictable world of what Wack called more of the same. However, given the long lead times for new oil projects, it was soon realised that the 6-year horizon was too limited. In 1971, Shell therefore decided to try scenario planning as a potentially better framework for thinking about the future than forecasts, which were perceived as a dangerous substitute for real thinking in times of uncertainty. As such, decision-making at Shell moved constantly between narrow questions related to specific situations, i.e., should we invest in a new offshore platform in the North Sea, and broad ones related to the world at large. What's going to happen to the Soviet Union and its oil reserves? So successful were scenario plannings that Shell was able to anticipate 2 Arab-induced oil shocks during those decades. In 1972, concomitantly with Pierre Wack's work, researchers published their much-debated book, The Limits to Growth, which presented selected scenarios for world resource consumption. This publication brought the word scenario to the attention of the general public in 1972. The Limits to Growth report explored potential exponential economic and population growth models with respect to finite supply of resources, studied for the first time through computer simulation through numerous scenarios. Several of the scenarios saw overshoot and collapse of the global population by the mid to latter part of the 21st century, while another scenario resulted in a stabilised world. If scenario planning is defined generally as exploration of alternative options before formulating a plan, then scenario planning has been central to the practice of land use planning and landscape planning since at least the 1970s. The work of landscape and regional planner Ian McHarg being just one example. As documented in his 1971 book Design with Nature, McHarg proposed 3 land development scenarios formed in the regional study of Green Spring and Worthington valleys of Baltimore County, which is pictured. These scenarios were uncontrolled growth, linear arterial growth, and plan for the valleys and metro towns, each showing significantly different patterns of future urbanisation. So what are the different types of scenario planning within planning? You'll have noticed in the description of the development of scenario planning, there are different types of merging. Borenson offers a standard typology that classifies scenarios as either predictive, normative, or explorative. Predictive scenarios answer what will happen and are forecasts. Normative scenarios ask what should happen and define a preferred future for a place, enriched through careful analysis and consideration of alternatives. And explorative scenarios answer what could happen and are external or strategic. Exploratory scenarios are used to develop deeper insights into emerging trends and issues to inform specific decisions through the use of multiple scenarios for the future. Although planners use all 3 types of scenarios, they use more exploratory and normative scenarios and fewer predictive scenarios. Depending on the nature of the uncertainties under consideration, scenarios can be represented as qualitative narratives or in a conceptual or quantitative computer models. I'll now run you through some examples of each type to flesh this out. One example of predictive scenarios is the Australian Bureau of Statistics population growth scenarios. These series A, B and C projections derive from calculations of natural increase population, i.e. births minus deaths, and net overseas migration, and migrant arrivals minus migrant departures. It's impossible to know how accurate these will be. Indeed, predictive scenarios, otherwise known as forecasting, can be inaccurate because they ignore the potential of dramatic changes in the very measures being forecast. Forecasts are dangerous because they are usually constructed on the assumption that tomorrow's world will be much like today's. An example of a potential disruptor of population projections in Australia could be climate change refugees. In almost all projections, Asia will be ground zero for climate change, and there exists an array of alarming projections for the number of displaced people, which ranges from generally hovers around 200 million by mid-century, but we have projections as high as 1 billion from Christian Aid, projection made in 2007. These are not factored into the ABS forecasts and evidently could blow them out of the water. Okay, so many projects that use scenarios in planning are normative, i.e. they propose what should happen and define a set of preferred visions. This preponderance is probably due to the well-established tradition of visionary planning. Richard Weller's spatial scenarios in Boomtown for accommodating a doubling of population in Perth are normative as they define different possible preferred concepts. These include 5 alternative scenarios for spreading development and 3 scenarios for vertical development. The first of the horizontal scenarios, Pod City, proposes that 1.5 million people be accommodated in 48 new towns, each with a density 4 times that of conventional suburbia. Another scenario was Sea Change City, which was proposed to be a linear coastal city some 600 kilometres long, structured by a bullet train. Anyone who is involved in the day-to-day planning of cities and delivering infrastructure might consider these scenarios naive. However, they serve a purpose in terms of challenging existing thinking. They do, however, miss a method for assessing which scenario is the most advantageous to progress in planning. This Infrastructure Australia normative scenario planning exercise from 2018 plugs this gap. This scenario planning exercise yielded 3 different normative scenarios: the centralised high-density scenario, the rebalanced medium-density scenario, and the expanded low-density scenario, which are pictured. The project used accepted, validated indicators to compare the performance of the alternative scenarios. This was achieved using planning support systems to create, visualise and analyse urban scenarios. Then using algorithms which derive from research, the planning support system produces scores for each scenario against different indicators, such as likely effects on transport performance or access to jobs or access to hospitals, schools or green space. This is, of course, controversial because an algorithm can only ever provide a crude approximation of a real world's complexity. Nonetheless, it provides a guide as to the likely implications of a particular scenario. The next type of scenarios are exploratory scenarios. These explore possible futures without necessarily considering how desirable they are from a normative point of view. Planners conduct these projects when they want to deepen their understanding of external forces, by definition not controlled by participating stakeholders, and to spark broad public discussion about what the future might hold. In the intuitive approach associated with exploratory scenario development, scenarios are considered as an art. Accordingly, the development of stories and storylines are important. Many exploratory projects focus on specific decisions. Planners often need to know whether a decision should be contingent, i.e. made in only specific cases, or robust, made under multiple scenarios. Therefore, such projects often do not identify the preferred scenario, but rather evaluate a decision in light of the scenarios considered. This type of project is most applicable when the most important uncertainties are external and therefore out of participants' hands. The scenarios themselves are typically multi-themed, where each scenario is composed along a unique thematic dimension that emphasises the relationship between 2 specific factors set along X and Y axis. Exploratory scenario planning is a type of scenarios we'll explore mostly in this lecture. So let's take a look at some case studies. This is scenarios developed by Arup as part of their 2050 scenarios report. And in terms of this X and Y axis, on the Y-axis, they have planetary health improving at the top, planetary health declining at the bottom. On the X-axis, we have societal condition improving on the right and societal condition declining on the left. And these broadly define 4 scenarios, which are the Greenocracy, Post-Anthropocene, Humans Inc. and Extinction Express. So we'll now have a look at those scenarios. So the first one is post-Anthropocene. So this is improving planetary health and societal condition, defined by the top right of the diagram. As Arup described, in this scenario, people are living in harmony with the planet. The political and economic warning signs of unfettered consumption and persistent inequality prompted international and domestic collaboration to transform the status quo. Value-based economies that respect and integrate nature-based services have improved the quality of life for all species and humans. And human equality is pursued through accessible healthcare, housing, and a stable living wage. In short, this scenario depicts an ideal city, reconciled with its environmental limitations, but still maintaining urban livability. This is the image of the future that tantalises planners. The scenarios in the report are furnished with a timeline of hypothetical events and even characters, such as Taman, a resident of Jakarta's rehabilitated and partially urbanised marshes, who inhabits the scenario. So as we talked about before, it's very much about a narrative and a storyline. So there's a timeline within which the scenario unfolds and characters which bring it to life. The second scenario is entitled Greentocracy, which is defined on the top left of planetary health improving, but societal health declining. So as they explain, the protection and regeneration of Earth systems is a global priority which all humans are obligated to adhere to. Strict consumption quotas facilitated by invasive monitoring technology and authoritarian leadership have forced a societal transition from a linear to a circular economy. Extreme urban density has been enforced to preserve wildlands and the ecosystem services they provide. Meanwhile, civil liberties are suppressed to ensure humanity's support of the planetary agenda. In short, this scenario concerns a punitive kind of sustainability. The next scenario is entitled Humans Inc., which sits in the bottom right-hand corner of the diagram and alludes to a societal condition improving and planetary health declining. It's more or less a business as usual scenario. As Arup explained, Humans Inc. is the manifestation of our current people's first trajectory. Social progress is achieved at the cost of planetary health. While quality of life has vastly improved for a majority of the population, humanity must adapt to an increasingly inhospitable environment. The final scenario in the bottom left, declining societal condition and planetary health, is entitled Extinction Express. As Arup explained, an obsession with pursuing economic growth has caught up with the planet and affected humanity's quality of life. The depletion of Earth's natural resources has necessitated the expansion of new extractive frontiers in space and the deep sea. The absence of social services makes coping with health implications of air pollution, job insecurity, and destruction of property from extreme weather events and drought-induced food insecurity only possible for affluent people. And again, we get a timeline here. Things to note would be in 2038, another safe hell opened. As Arup explained, safe hells, in inverted commas, have been created across the globe to house climate refugees, many on floating islands and in deserts to keep them far away from the rest of the population. Okay, so how do we actually conduct scenario planning? Peter Schwartz, the scenario planner, distills the exploratory scenario planning method into convenient steps. We'll go through these in detail now, using a particular brief example. Okay, so I thought here we could get a little personal. Real estate is an obsession of Australians, and a reasonable question to be considering could be a focal decision. For instance, should I get a large mortgage to buy an investment property? Okay, it's probably on the minds of many. So firstly, in conducting exploratory scenario planning, we would then try and categorise important driving forces in the environment that affect the decision. Okay, so in relation to getting a mortgage to buy an investment property, some of the factors you might consider would be macro factors like, can we expect continuing population growth in Western Australia? But also much more close to home factors like, is my job secure? What is the likely success of my double income marriage? So what we then need to do is rank these driving forces by their importance to the focal decision, should I get the investment property, and by the degree of uncertainty. For instance, population growth is fairly certain. However, perhaps my job security and marriage is less certain. So we translate the driving forces into alternative scenarios. So we select two uncertainties that form an axis, which results in the four scenarios described by four possible combinations. So we flesh out the scenarios by developing a narrative. E.g., due to a widespread AI uptake, I am retrenched by my employer who is downsizing. So let's go through these scenarios now. So in secure work, scenario one, we have work insecurity, but the double income marriage is looking fine. Scenario 2, we have insecure work, but possible separation and a halving of the household income. Scenario 3, the marriage is secure and the work is secure and life is good. And scenario 4, we have secure work, but we experience a separation and a loss of income. So we need to flesh out these scenarios to try and bring them to life, and naming them is really important in this process of making them real. So then we apply the resulting scenarios to the original focal decision. E.g., is the decision to buy a new property robust in all scenarios? Is it a no regrets policy decision? For instance, you might consider that in a scenario like scenario 2, where we're both separated, family income has been reduced to half, and we're experiencing the issues of go with insecure work, we might find ourselves needing to offload the house to repay the mortgage because we can't maintain the repayments. However, in other scenarios where we have secure work and a secure double income marriage, perhaps it's okay. But what we find is that the decision is contingent on which scenario we're in to be successful. It's not robust in all scenarios, which means we should proceed with some caution. Finally, then we need to select leading indicators that may suggest which of the scenarios are closest to the current course of events. E.g., is my employer asking for voluntary redundancies? If so, then we might be tracking towards scenario 1 or 2, and insecure work. Okay, in conclusion, each of us responds not to the world, but to our image of the world. This mindset includes attitudes about every situation in our lives. In many cases, these mindsets have been built up slowly from childhood and might not have much to do with actual reality. In response, scenario planning makes us question our decision agendas consciously in a systematic manner. Indeed, one of the purposes of scenarios is to help you suspend your disbelief in possible futures. This is important because some black swans are hard to believe, even when they did actually happen. Did the world just shut down because of an unprecedented communicable disease? Did terrorists really fly passenger planes into the World Trade Center? I hope that today will in some way compel you to reorganize your mental model of the future and how planning may respond to it. Thanks for listening.